Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of What Does the Bible Say About? Today we're going to be looking at the question of the millennial reign of Christ. What does the Bible say about the millennial reign of Christ in Revelation chapter 20? Now this is a question that many Christians have. Many Christians often wonder, about the book of Revelation. It's a very difficult book. What do the things mean in Revelation? All the things that are going on, all the different images and symbols and so on. And very often, one of the most particular questions, or the most frequent questions that's asked is, how are we to understand the millennial reign that's described, the 1,000-year reign that's described in Revelation chapter 20? You know that the dead are going to come to life and reign with Christ for 1,000 years, that Christ himself will reign for 1,000 years. What do all of these things mean? So that's the question that we're going to be addressing. And I'm actually going to break this up into three parts. In part one, we're going to just give an overview of the different positions that there are. In part two, I'm going to give a critique of premillennialism. And in part three, I'm going to give a critique of postmillennialism, and thereby arguing for the third position, which is amillennialism. And now at this point, then I've told you what the three different views are that we're going to be discussing and giving an overview of in this particular episode. And that is premillennialism, postmillennialism, and amillennialism. So let's get started with those. Premillennialism. What does it mean to be a premillennialist with regard to the millennial reign of Christ? Well, this is all of these terms and positions are ways of describing the relationship between the timing of the return of Christ with the millennial reign that's described in Revelation chapter 20. So if you are a premillennialist, you believe in a premillennial return of Christ. That is to say that Christ returns on a timeline, Christ returns, and then there is a 1,000-year reign where Christ reigns on the earth. So Christ's return happens before the millennial reign. You are a premillennialist. If you are a postmillennialist, or if you are an amillennialist, in both cases, you believe that Christ's return happens after the 1,000-year reign, and there are then different understandings with postmillennialism and amillennialism as to the nature of the 1,000 years, but both of them will, in some sense, be postmillennial, in that they believe that Christ will return after the 1,000-year reign, as it's described in Revelation chapter 20. Now, the difference between a postmillennial and an amillennial is that a postmillennial will believe in some kind of golden age. There are some who will say that they are non-golden age postmillennials, but even they will still say, even though they don't use the language of golden age, there's still something in the future, or even perhaps even now, where the church will thrive to such a degree. There will be a fully Christianized society that is fundamentally distinct from, in some ways, the church age before, even if there are lines of continuity. So there's some kind of Christian society that we're moving towards, and that's distinct from the rest of the church age. If you're an amillennial, you would teach fundamental continuity throughout the entire church age. So that's the difference. So there's no distinction, meaning not. There is no distinction between the millennial reign in Revelation 20 and the entire church age. It's all one thing, and there's continuity throughout all of it. Now, within the premillennial view, there are actually two variations. There is historic premillennialism, and there is dispensational premillennialism. Dispensational premillennialism being quite new in terms of the history of the church as a whole, being only perhaps 120, 130 years old, something like that. And this is related to dispensationalism more generally, which teaches a fundamental discontinuity between the Old and New Testament, a fundamental discontinuity between the church and the nation of Israel. And this then affects the nature of the millennial reign that they see as happening after the return of Christ. And so in this view, there is the church age is almost a parenthesis. Christ returns, and then there is a millennial reign where some of the great things that were promised to the Jews will be fulfilled. And then there is the consummation then at the end of the 1,000 years. There is also, however, historic premillennialism, which is basically premillennialism without the dispensational adages. And this is it is actually quite an old view. There is quite a history of historic premillennialism as opposed to dispensational premillennialism. And this basically just teaches more basically that there is going to be the return of Christ followed by 1,000 years reign, which will then follow with the consummation of all things. And so, though it is correct to say that there are three views, in some sense there are only two views, in that with regard to the timing of the millennial reign, you will either see Christ's return as being before or after. And then there are kind of two sub-views. If you are premillennial, you could either be a historic premillennialist or a dispensational premillennialist. And if you believe that Christ will return after the millennial reign, if you're in some sense a postmillennial, or in this broad sense a postmillennial, you can then have either of the two views being a more fundamentally a postmillennialist or an amillennialist. Both of those are similar in that they both see that Christ will return after the 1,000-year reign. So hopefully you found this helpful as a brief overview of these things. As I said in part 2, I'm going to give a critique of premillennialism, and then we'll move on to discuss postmillennialism and amillennialism. Again, I hope you found this helpful. Please, if you would like any other questions to be answered, you can either leave a comment in our comment section of any of our social media posts where you find these things, and we'll do our best to get to them. Hopefully this has been informative for you, and that it is helpful to you in understanding these very difficult passages in the Scripture.